Thank you, Dean Boysen, and thank you all of you for being here today. Today's topic speaks about who counts, who's included. So it's only fitting that we begin this talk acknowledging that Case Western Reserve University itself resides on ancestral lands of the Lenape, Delaware, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, Shawnee, Wyandot, Miami, Ottawa, Potawatomi, and other Great Lakes tribes. This land of the Northwest Territory was ceded under force and by a treaty that was not honored by the United States of America. Today, tens of thousands of Native Americans live in Northeast Ohio and call this their home. Neighbors, friends, and coworkers of ours. And in my role at the Social Justice Institute, we are committed to helping our university actively engage in learning and acknowledging this history of injustice and promoting action toward healing and inclusion and reparations. So with that context, let's get started. The problem is that so many projects, why are so many projects led by popular civic leaders and institutions often face pushback, objections, protests from the community? The answer is often due to a lack of authentic community engagement with the people most affected, which leads to a loss of trust in the institutions and in those leaders themselves. So today I want to start with an analysis of this problem before providing a framework for authentic community engagement. We'll then look at a number of practice areas with case examples before I end with some reflections about how we can apply a racial equity lens to this issue in this work. So let's begin by thinking about an all too often situation when public officials are making a decision that affects a community, like a piece of vacant land in a neighborhood. The first thing that often happens is that those public officials sit behind a closed door, discuss the situation, and make a decision that affects the community, such as how to redevelop that parcel. And they come up with a plan, and they make a decision, and they start working on it. The next thing they do is begin to educate the community about the need and why this piece of blighted property, or whatever label they put on it, needs to be redeveloped. Then they come back sometime later and announce a decision. With great fanfare and architectural drawings, they describe what's going to happen here and the dates when it's going to be implemented. Well, as you might expect, this announcement is often met with resistance, with a flurry of questions. Did you consider X? How is this going to benefit us? Why didn't you consult us? These officials and developers then spend the next weeks and months defending their decision, even sometimes fighting lawsuits. And at this point, it's very hard to go back because they've already invested time and resources into this process, and they've begun an implementation plan. So we call this the dead approach. It's a dead-end approach. How many of you have witnessed this in a community or institution? It's quite familiar, isn't it? Yes. So what's the rationale for this approach? Why would well-intentioned leaders do this? I think there's three main reasons. First, I believe they think this is more efficient than going to the community and beginning to raise concerns and questions from the community. So this is an efficiency reason. The second is that the leaders believe they already know what the community wants. Or even sometimes more paternalistically, they believe that what they will propose to the community is better than what the community might want itself, that they know better than the community. And then the other reason this happens is what I call the right answer approach. I've seen this over and over again where public officials believe if they just come up with the right answer that addresses as many of the concerns of the community as possible, concerns they assume they already know what they are, that the community will buy it. But we know that people react negatively to something that is being done to them without them, even if it's a good solution. Doesn't have to be this way. Increasingly, everyday people are saying nothing for us without us and are demanding a place at the table. Let's now look at a framework for authentic community engagement. So one helpful tool we use in our classes is called the spectrum of public participation, which lays out different goals and promises to the community. One of the common problems that leads to the dead approach is that public leaders have expectations that align with the left side of informing the community about what they're doing. And the community, on the other hand, wants to be consulted or involved. And so there's a difference of expectations. In general, as you move to the right, public participation increases, as does joint ownership of the decision. So authentic community engagement comes by agreeing on clear roles for everyday people in this process, in the decisions that affect them, and hopefully more toward the middle or the right. So stepping back for a moment, what are the values and guiding principles to nothing for us without us, to ensure that engagement is actually authentic? 3 values that I would lift up is the first is building genuine and respectful relationships with residents at the center. This is a relationship, resident-driven process. And then reciprocity is another value that we hold highly. The recognition and respect and valuing of the knowledge and perspectives and resources that each partner contributes to the relationship. Public institutions have resources and knowledge, so does the community. And how do they partner? And then the third is to see diversity as a strength. Better decisions are made when there's diverse views shared and when different identity groups actually participate. If public officials and leaders want to avoid the dead approach, there is an alternative approach that promotes authentic community relationships, inclusive decision-making, and more sustainable solutions. It begins with what Brian Stevenson calls getting proximate. Authentically engage and get proximate to those most affected by the decision. Listen to learn, not to defend or to counter, but to truly learn, being open to that indigenous wisdom and knowledge from people in their communities. Invest time and resources in the process. There's not a quick fix to community development or community change. Invest the time it takes to do that. And value the people as experts of their own lived experience and respect the power that they actually hold as members of their community. And then exercise humility and honor agreements. So many times we see, even when there's an engagement process, a decision is made in public and it goes back behind closed doors and that decision is altered. So we have to honor agreements. This process will make communities come alive. So what are the key principles to this alive process? First, having clear objectives that are communicated openly, with clear objectives about the role of participation of residents. To be transparent with no hidden agenda. Having inclusive participation by the diverse stakeholder groups as we've talked about. And then building the capacity of all the stakeholders to ensure full participation. Too many times there's a set of information, knowledge, technical information that the community does not know. We need to educate the community about those dynamics in order to have a full process. And we recognize that conflicts will arise. So being prepared and anticipating that differences will emerge and having conflict resolution methods in place. And then finally, separating dialogue for reaching mutual understanding from deliberation, where you weigh out alternatives, to the actual decision-making process. So that's a bit about the authentic community engagement. Now let's turn to some practice areas where these principles are actually carried out, where engagement is central. And I'll offer a few of these and illustrate them with some of my own experience. So let's start with peace building. Early in my career, I supported local peace and reconciliation commissions in Nicaragua that served as a communication bridge to the peace process between the Sandinista government and the counter-revolutionaries. This was the ultimate nothing for us without us, as thousands of Contra soldiers out in the bush refused to disarm until their concerns and needs were heard and incorporated into the peace accords and the demobilization plans being planned at the top. A second area of practice, also in my early career, is in restorative justice, where direct engagement is the focus of the process. I began my career working in victim offender mediation, and in restorative justice, crime is not defined as a violation of a law, but actually as a breakdown in the social fabric of society and a breakdown in relationships. So the restorative process is to engage the victim, the offender, and the community directly in making it right. An area we do a lot of work in today is called asset-based community development, which recognizes that on the left, if we focus on needs and what's not there, and we end up providing services to meet those needs, we actually create a vicious cycle of dependency and create more needs. So in asset-based community development, the approach is identifying what's there, what are the strengths. And the ABCD approach says that even in the most disadvantaged neighborhood or blighted neighborhood, whatever the name is, there are 6 types of community assets that exist that can be mobilized to create the community of our dreams. So asset-based community development is a process that we used in a community where I grew up, in Elkhart, Indiana. The city of Elkhart, Indiana had created this comprehensive economic development strategy called We Thrive, that included major revitalization work in the most lowest income neighborhood in the city. And like DEAD, they announced the project to the neighborhood without an engagement strategy. But fortunately, they were open to slowing down to engage the community. The Community Innovation Network and our team was asked to facilitate an alive process with a group of neighborhood organizers. And that included a visioning process that built on existing assets in the community that we had mapped, and the development of residents' priorities through a World Cafe for what is to become a complete neighborhood. The city of Elkhart has now adopted those priorities set by the community for the We Thrive initiative. And we're pleased to see that happen. So you can see this is an example that started out in the Inform, and it moved from consulting to actually involving the community. And the results are much better. The last example is a shout out to one of our graduates. The Federal Reserve System, led by Mandel School alum Tiffany Holland Wright from the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond, has created a team that is changing the way the Federal Reserve Bank conducts research. Instead of simply collecting quantitative data on a community, which is traditional Federal Reserve Bank research, researchers will now be encouraged and guided to engage members in the community in the process. They are working from within the Federal Reserve, led by their own community development staff and participatory researchers in the Fed, to transform all 12 Federal Reserve Bank branches. So I'll just add here, these are macro examples, but we have many examples at our school where strength-based approaches to change are being taught to our direct practice students that build on client strengths and on the networks, that assets in their current networks. So now let's go back and analyze the DEAD model one more time and the lack of inclusion and self-determination. It's not just about well-intentioned people using that DEAD approach. There's often a deeper level of exclusion and discrimination that we have to confront. Some people and some communities are systematically excluded. We know, and we teach this in our classes, that the history of redlining in this country, with a map of Cleveland and the urban center being redlined, that it reveals that public policy over several decades systematically denied opportunities for home ownership and wealth building in urban communities of color, in the red areas here. In this context, so in these neighborhoods, exclusion was created in the neighborhoods, and they were not allowed to receive subsidies for home ownership, while simultaneously creating subsidized paths for the middle and upper middle class pathways for white families who were exclusively given opportunities in the suburbs. So racism was at the core of these decisions, which posited that some people were a risk to others, that their presence alone would be a threat to others' upward mobility. So racism and white dominance carried out through public housing and infrastructure policies created the unjust disparities that we actually still see today. New policies continue these trends, and this is just one in terms of mortgage lending. And urban poverty then is not really the result of individual and family choices, but of systemic racism. In this context, the right to speak is not enough. Simply an empty promise if it's within the context of systematic exclusion and inequity. Nothing about us without us is the mantra of the movement for disability rights that now has been adopted by many, many groups who have been systematically marginalized. And we'll continue to see these inequities until we commit to racial equity and racial justice. So we need a deeper analysis of how did we get to this situation that looks at institutional and systemic levels of racism. We use the power cube in our classes, and our students are presenting a campaign tomorrow that uses this level of analysis. So I want to look at the spaces side of this and the forms of power side. Because many decisions are made in closed spaces and in hidden forms of power. Hidden power is the exercised when certain actors are explicitly excluded from the political agenda and public decision making, as we've seen in these examples before. Strategies to overcome these forces are created by combining community organizing, leadership development, movement building, and participatory research. Ways to build the organizational strength of everyday people, create legitimacy and voice of the poor and the excluded. So that's the hidden form of power. Now let's talk about the invisible form of power, which is that internalized sense of powerlessness that many in our communities face. That's the result of ideology and belief systems. To counter this, change efforts really need to focus on consciousness raising and solidarity work to strengthen people's confidence in their experience, their sense, their rights, and their critical thinking abilities. We have a partner here in Cleveland, the Third Space Action Lab, that does an excellent job of this. So simultaneous to this work on the forms of power, we need to think about the spaces where decisions are made, which we've touched on already. So change efforts in these situations often include assertive tactics, like the residents in Elkhart, Indiana did, to create claimed spaces where those affected demanded a place at a table. So they created their own forums, their own process. As power dynamics change, those in authority are encouraged to lessen the number of closed spaces and to create more invited spaces. So analyzing power in this way looks at the systemic and institutional racism, but we also have to recognize there's another level we must confront, and that's the individual level. Ultimately, we must commit to become an anti-racist, as Ibram Kendi talks about. For those of us who were born being told that we were white, we must examine where we are at on this spectrum and this framework. And this work requires us to become uncomfortable, accepting our complicity and doing our work to learn and to grow into these other areas. This is a really helpful tool, and we could spend a whole talk just on this alone. So as we apply community engagement to this process, we need to expand the voice, whether looking at both systemic racism and individual racism. We need to expand the voices of those who are often censored in public spaces and invite full expression of all participants without tone policing. So, we at the Community Innovation Network have been actively working over the past number of years to foster authentic community engagement here between the university and our surrounding neighborhoods. So the primary vehicle for doing this is Foundations of Community Building. This is an 8-month program, cohort model, comprised of half neighborhood residents and half representatives from the university. Confronting systemic racism is an explicit part of the curriculum, and you'll see Dr. Fletcher is one of our trainers there. In addition to receiving 5 trainings, they participate in action and learning circles where issues are addressed that are of concern to them. And participants report that the #1 outcome is the trusting relationships that form between the residents and the university. And their view of the university changes as well. So one early result of this work was one of those first action and learning circles kept meeting after they went through the program and formed a task force that led to the formation of the first CWRU Neighborhood Advisory Council. This is a group that reports directly to the president of the university and that has a small amount of funds to actually support community engagement, university community engagement relationships. One long-term resident, as you see in this quote, commented at the orientation hosted by President Kaler and Provost Vinson in Adelbert Hall, the boardroom of the university, and he said, "We have waited 40 years to hear someone from the university say what you have said today." It's a powerful experience for all of us in the room. And there were tears shed, and there was a recognition that we could do better. So I hope that I have helped clarify how public leaders and institutions so often miss the mark by doing for a community rather than with them. There are principles and practice that result in authentic engagement and equitable relationships if we have the courage to use them. So throughout my career, I've witnessed the fear to engage, fear on both sides, dissipate as processes are developed and skilled facilitation provides a way to move forward together. So I'll end with a few simple recommendations that you can integrate into your practice using the Alive approach and nothing for us without us. First, consider how you might incorporate this nothing Alive approach and nothing for us without us into your practice. Incorporate anti-racism to challenge the white dominant assumptions that define problems, that limit voice, that predetermine intervention paths and the role of everyday people. And then promote ways that increase everyday people's influence and the role the decisions affect them. And begin by getting proximate, as we've talked about. Our country is in desperate need of shifting how we relate to one another, and I invite you to join me on this effort to be alive. Thank you.